Here we gather today to commemorate and remember the life of the Academy Gate. He was so young. Quiet in the back. After months of dutiful service, you are no longer needed. Thank you for being a good circle. The best circle! I said quiet! How do I end one of these things? Rest in peace out! Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, the Colosseum update is out in Elden Ring, and as much as many people had suspected that this would happen, that Colosseums would be opened and used for proper arena matchmaking PvP within Elden Ring, no one could have predicted what we actually got. Duels? Sure, that makes sense. Team battles? Sure, why not? Free-for-all? Yeah, we've seen it before. Elimination mode? Well, that's a bit funky. Wait, summons are permitted in all of the modes? Does that say summons permitted? Yeah. It does. That's right, along with the new matchmaking PvP modes added to the game, we also got an alternate rule set, and this rule set allows the use of Spirit Ashes in literally every available PvP mode, and just makes the whole thing that much more chaotic, and that much more interesting as well. Sure, you can just play without them if you don't like the idea of having them around, but the concept of being able to use Spirit Summons in PvP is just so unbelievably intriguing and unusual. And so after a number of hours of messing around with a whole bunch of them to try and get a handle on how it all feels, together as a system, I'm ready to bring you all my Colosseum PvP Spirit Summon tier list. It's worth noting that the contestants on this list today aren't all of the Spirit Summons in the game, simply the ones that were used in my PvE Spirit Summon tier list, which were generally considered to be some of the best in the entire game back at that point, except the little jar boys, which I just put on there because I think they're lovely little lads and no one can convince me otherwise.
They're my children.
As well, I am looking at this mostly from the perspective of duels, as those are the most controlled mode, whereas the elimination style modes are just a whole different kind of chaos, though I will make note of ones I think could be particularly better in other modes based on my findings as well. With that said, there will likely be some summons that come up over the coming weeks that work their way into the strange PvP Spirit Summon meta that's beginning to form, but I'm ready to share with you all my findings and thoughts on what works and what doesn't when it comes to Spirit Ashes in PvP. So without further ado, let's start all the way on the bottom at the D tier. First up, we have the Jellyfish summon. This one isn't great for this purpose. It doesn't move quickly at all, it fires off low damage projectiles, and it will deal poison buildup. The problem here, though, is three-pronged. Projectiles aren't great in these PvP modes unless they move super quickly. They're easy to see from a distance and thus easy to avoid without even having to roll. All you have to do is walk sideways. A non-moving enemy is really easy to defeat, so if they try to decide and kill the jellyfish, they have an easy time doing so. And also the poison buildup on the attacks is just too small. Even if the jellyfish manages to hit 3 or 4 times in relative succession, you won't really get a poison proc, and on top of that, these duels just end up being too fast for poison to be a big deal anyways, unless you are using a poison build yourself. The one caveat to this is if you build around poison, having a spirit summon that speeds up the poison buildup might be good too. Then secondly, we have Latina the Albinauric, and I had really high hopes for her before I tried it out. In PvE, this one's really cool. It sits in one spot where you summon it, unable to move, and then fires off volleys of magic arrows that do pretty good damage. In PvP, it stands in one spot, unable to move, and as a result, is very easy to kill for your opponent. It doesn't actually hit the arrows all that often, and when it does, they just don't do a whole lot of damage. Already you may be noticing a couple of patterns here, and I'll go over the generalities of what makes summons good or bad for PvP at the end of all this, in case it isn't made completely clear by my choices. Next up is the Soul Jar of Fortune Ashes. This spawns a bunch of little jars that run up to your enemy, and they explode when they come into contact with fire. These guys aren't fantastic, they're a bit slow, a bit squishy, and unfortunately you cannot make them explode by using fire yourself in PvP, even though you can do that in PvE. I was really hoping that you could just lob a fire pot into a cluster of these guys and have them blow up your opponent so I could call them S+ tier, but they sadly just don't work like that. The one situation they may be good in is if your opponent has a one-trick build based around fire, in which case they could potentially just blow themselves up by accident.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
After that, we have the Castalian Ashes, and this one is just super mediocre. It's very tanky unless your opponent is using striking damage weapons, in which case it folds like a piece of paper. This would be great if it did more melee attacks, but again, this one for the most part just fires off piddly little projectiles that don't move too quick and don't do too much damage even if they hit, making it hard to really justify, even though it is hard to kill for most enemy players. Then comes Dolores the Sleeping Arrow Puppet, and this one is interesting. Theoretically, having a summon with the ability ability to apply sleep to a player is great, right? A wonderful concept if it happens, but sort of like the Jellyfish, this one suffers quite a bit. It only fires slow projectiles, it doesn't fire often, and even if it hits a couple in a row, it won't get asleep particularly quickly. The one caveat that I'll make to this one is in team battles, it may work a fair bit better. If it is allowed to just fire off sleep arrows from off screen on repeat, it may well earn you a full elimination in that specific mode, but generally speaking, I think just a full team of the higher tier summons on this list would probably do more for you anyways. With that said, let's move on up to the B tier today and start with the Warhawk Ashes. This one is decent. It can stay alive pretty well as it relies quite heavily on hit and run tactics from the air. It can fire a little bit of fire breath, which is nice to have around, and otherwise it just does strafing runs occasionally with melee hits. It doesn't apply a whole lot of pressure, but it is more likely to get a hit in than most other spirit summons, even if those hits don't do much damage. It's definitely not bad, there is just one that fills a very similar role and does it significantly better that I'll talk about later. Next up is the Ancestral Follower Ashes, and this one is sort of hit and miss in my opinion. It starts out as a ranged summon with a big old bow, which sadly isn't the most effective thing in PvP as I've stated up to this point. Projectiles just aren't really that strong unless they move really fast through the air, but it can also transfer into a melee mode. The melee mode and the fact that it is actually reasonably tanky is why I put it up here. The ranged mode just doesn't do a whole lot, sadly. After that we have Redmane Knight Oleg. This one is particularly interesting as while it does use a great bow, it fires off gravity shots which are actually quite potent if they hit. As well, if you use the Warcry weapon skill, you can both give it a damage buff and cause it to do a special move, and these interactions are definitely interesting if you happen to be building around a Warcry anyways. But it also swaps to a melee mode when the enemy gets too close, which while alright, isn't anything to write home about compared to the other melee summons. Then comes the DemiHuman Ashes. This group of 5 little guys is reasonably good. They're great at grouping up on an enemy and causing some pressure, forcing them to just play on the defensive for a little bit, but also they aren't particularly tanky, and so if your opponent has any reliable kind of AoE damage at all, they can just take out the whole pack in a couple of hits like it's nothing. This one is pretty situational, and sadly it looks like the arena combat never takes place at night, and so you can't even get their bonus buff either. And now we move on to the A tier. These are summons that are at properly decent levels, but for the most part still have situational flaws. First up here then is going to be Clean Rot Knight Finley. This one is just on the borderline of being a tier down, but the potential good is too much to ignore. The projectiles this one fires are the Holy Scythe blasts, and they're reasonably speedier than an arrow, and so they have a higher chance of hitting, as well as coming out of a bit of an unusual angle to make it a bit harder to dodge too. It has decent melee attacks, and the main thing keeping it up where it is the situational usefulness of Scarlet Rot. This summon can apply Scarlet Rot, but it is a struggle to get it to do so in the Colosseum. It isn't consistent by any means, and so this one I have rated here more for its potential than for what it tends to do in an average arena match. Next up then we have Lutel the Headless, and this one is just really interesting. She is quite tanky, she has the ability to teleport next to her target so you can't just blind sprint away from her, and while she does tend to do more time guarding than attacking, her weapon attacks do apply Death Blight, which considering this is PvP is something that you can actually trigger on a player with this summon now. That said, the buildup is quite low per hit it would seem, and the second that your opponent realizes what is happening when they do get hit, they will avoid her attacks at all cost. So again, this one is situationally incredible if the Death Blight does actually happen for obvious reasons, but otherwise it just provides good pressure staying up in your opponent's face and striking the fear of the possibility of Death Blight into them.
Don't touch me.
After that, we have the Greatshield Soldier Ashes, and I actually rate this one quite highly for what it is. They won't do nearly any damage at all when they hit, but there are 5 of them. They spend all of their time guarding, which makes it hard to actually kill them despite they have low HP pools, and they hit with their shields all the time, which actually have some really good stagger rating, so the pressure they put on your opponent is fantastic. The only real weakness here they have is they can be taken out pretty quick by the right AoE spell or weapon skill, so they aren't perfect, but when they work, oh man do they work. I'd honestly say that these are either the best or second best of the multi-target summons that I've seen played with. On a similar note, we have the Lone Wolf Spirit Ashes, which summons 3 playful little dogs ready to rip out your enemy's throat. These ones apply incredible pressure. The only issue is that they are extremely squishy for obvious reasons. However, if you can protect them by just staying near them and not letting your enemy focus them down, they will do a lot to make the fight easier in general. Again, the only reason they aren't higher is that it's just too easy to actually kill them if you do decide to focus on doing so. Then comes Stormhawk Dean, and this is like the Warhawk I talked about earlier, but significantly improved. It flies up out of range for most of the fight, it does strafing runs in to hit where it will actually do pretty decent damage and is quite decent at getting the hits off too. It can do a Warcry effect which buffs your own weapons damage by 20%, which is obviously invaluable in the middle of a duel. The only real weakness of this one is pretty much right when it spawns. It isn't really that tanky, and so if your opponent decides to just immediately attack it the second it exists, it'll die in 2 or 3 hits, and then you'll be in a 1v2 against them and their summons. If you can protect it until it gets airborne though, it works absolute wonders. Then we move on up to the S tier. These are all ones that I consider to be very good, some a bit more situational than others, but they just don't have a whole lot of weaknesses. First up, we have everyone's favorite, the Mimic tier. If your build is specifically one that complements the Mimic tier, it is one of the best summons in the game. If your build isn't one of those, it's basically useless. What I'm talking about is either builds that are fully meaty strength weapons built to 1 or 2 shot your enemy, things like that, or big hefty spell builds that your Mimic can take advantage of not having an actual FP pool for. I once went across a Mimic using Placidusax's rune, and that would have destroyed me if I had reacted to it just a touch slower than I did. Now though, let's talk about the negatives. Not only does this one cost you health instead of FP, it actually costs quite a bit of health. In duels you get no healing, so this puts you at an innate disadvantage in the overall fight. And in elimination modes you only get 1 healing flask for life, so if you have to use it right at the start of said life, it's not really ideal. On top of that, the Mimic takes about 5 seconds longer to spawn than any other summon in the game, and so if your opponent just straight up rushes you entirely aggressively, it's entirely possible the fight will be over before your Mimic even exists to do things that are helpful. Outside of that though, it is obviously fantastic. Next up is the Dung Eater puppet summon, and this one is just quite strong in the general sense. It is relatively aggressive in melee range, it does great damage, and there is no real straight up downside to this summon in general. It is just a very solid all-rounder to apply decent pressure while living for the entire fight. Then finally for this tier we have banished Knight Oleg, the dual sword wielding Wind Knight. He is tanky, he is aggressive, and for the most part he will spend his whole active time just running around trying to slash at your enemy and keeping really good pressure up as a result. The only negatives are when he stops to do a wind stomp, but that said, if your enemy is beside him when that happens, it obviously turns into a positive. So in general he's just extremely strong, great tankiness, good damage, and great pressure. With that we move up to the S+ tier for our absolute legends, and there are only 2 that I put in here, and they are both great here for good reasons. The first is Black Knife Tiche. Of course you all know her deal. She fires off dust and death projectiles, and these fire off quick enough that you can actually rely on them more than pretty much any other projectile from a summon. She's extremely evasive in general combat, and that results in overall tankiness that makes her hard to remove from the fights. And then her general attacks are quite frequent as well, meaning she provides pretty good pressure as well. Add all of that on top of reducing your opponent's max HP, and it works out quite nice as a whole. Then finally today, the one that I believe is the absolute strongest that I've tried, that is Omen Killer Rollo. This one is just an absolute king in the Colosseum PvP modes. He has 2 really big swords, and he has an intense amount of aggression that will keep your enemy on their toes even if you aren't attacking them yourself. His hits apply bleed, which is great for extra damage. His weapon swings themselves do decent damage and good stagger, and he also has a fire breath he can do every once in a while that does multiple ticks over the duration. On top of that, he's really tanky, but his main advantage is just the ludicrous amount of pressure that he applies, keeping your enemy locked into running away and rolling 100% of the time, even before you start attacking them too as the player. He is just head and shoulders the most pressure that I've seen applied by a summon within the Colosseum. And that's all of them. In case you missed them, the general patterns that I've noticed is that summons that purely fire projectiles just aren't great unless the projectiles move quickly. Summons that don't move are super easy for your opponent to just kill and remove from the playing field. Multi-summons are fantastic as long as your opponent doesn't have reliable area of effect damage, but you can't count on that. Status applying summons are a bit unreliable, as it takes a lot of hits to actually proc the status, but if it happens, it's obviously great. And then finally, the big thing that makes a summon great in PvP is quite simply pressure. The more pressure a summon can apply, the easier the fight becomes for you as a player. It creates openings for free, and that lets you do your thing. I hope you're all enjoying your time in the Colosseum so far, everyone, and I hope you've enjoyed this ranking of the spirit summons I've been messing around with for a while now within my PvP experience. Of course, let me know if there are any summons not on this list that you found particularly effective, but trust me, you want to give Omen Killer Rollo a go if you haven't tried it yet. It is just silly what that guy can do. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.